This is Beyond a Reasonable Doubt with your hosts, Mark Garrigus and Adam Carolla.
Yeah, get it on. Got to get on. No choice. We're going to mandate get in on. And welcome to Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. Mark Garrigus dressed to the nines in court today. Where are you, Mark?
I'm in parts unknown. I'll reveal on Thursday. I've been lectured so extensively about revealing anything about what I'm doing today that I'll tease it for Thursday's show.
Fair enough. So, yes. Gary briefed me on a couple of the stories. I was just going to say, not in the state. Okay. What should we start with? There's a embarrassment of riches this week. Well, Gary was telling me about a story out of Canada that had to do sort of on the subject of COVID and exposure, not exposure to the virus, but exposure for China financially. I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah, that was the case where Iran was found to have shot down a passenger jet with 153 people on it, and Canada has ruled that those families can seek restitution. Was that Lockerbie, or was that another event? It was the one right after we killed Soleimani.
It was more.
Oh, okay. Oh, that.
Right.
Oh, that one.
It was right after Soleimani. Now, what's interesting about this is you would assume, maybe I assume, that it had to be an intentional act. You know, they shot it down. That's an intentional act. That's a way, and I readily admit I'm not any expert or even close on Canadian law, but if you were to bring that in the U.S., you'd have certain hurdles you'd have to get over to get through sovereign immunity. The interesting thing here, based on your conspiracy theory that is rapidly not becoming so much a conspiracy, but a possibility, Dr. Fauci even conceded he's not convinced this was a natural migration of COVID. If, in fact, China, this was an escape from the Wuhan lab. And if they knew that, which you and I talked about last show, that the fact that they shut it down immediately and kind of put a dome over Wuhan would suggest they knew what they were dealing with. And then they intentionally, this is where the kind of, you might be able to thread the needle on sovereign immunity. If the intention was to mislead the world, the U.S., they're starting to see the contours of a mass action / some kind of an action for the consequences of what China has done, if in fact all of those things play out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, there's a few things at play. I mean, first off, we can present them with a bar tab. You know, we can calculate, here's how many businesses and, you know, here's how much devastation it costs, you know, financially. And also, they're not an empty bag, as Mike August would say. You know, you can't sue Dr. Alien in front of 10E for defecating in your potted plant. But, I mean, you could, but he's an empty bag. China's
right. What good do I need who needs a default judgment? Well, I'll give you some damages right now. Why wouldn't there be a claim for roughly what the estimate of the COVID Relief Act is for the damages that were done to businesses? I mean, then you're talking trillions of dollars.
Right. So what you have is, you know, whether, you know, if it's force majeure, you know, if it's a pangolin or it's a bat, well, that just falls under force majeure, and that's just shit happens and, you know, act of God. But if you worked on it in the lab, then it's not, you know, we're trying to get it from, we're at manslaughter, and you're trying to get it to murder. You know what I mean? So, you know, pangolin is sort of manslaughter and force majeure, but then if you get into the lab, now there's some meat on the bone, and then if it escaped from the lab and you guys were negligent after it escaped from the lab, they've now stories coming out that the first 3 people who were infected worked at that lab. So if all that, and then there was essentially, the cover-up is always worse than the crime, and then there was, we're not going to let people in to inspect the lab and so on and so forth. They're also locking their people down but they're letting people travel to the United States when they had this knowledge. There's a lot to work with there, and they have deep pockets, so why not?
Well, and by the way, there are direct. You hit on something that had occurred to me in terms of you always want to try to kind of tell your narrative, if you will. The direct flights were going. The 3 people you mentioned got sick, I believe, in November of 2019. They were allowing direct flights all the way through from Wuhan to LAX for months after that. And I don't know about the lockdown, but it would be interesting to do a timeline on when they locked down Wuhan and did they lock down the flights out of there to LAX? Because if you're locking it down and you have the knowledge that there's something that's man-made that has escaped and is terribly wrong, yet you know that it's contagious and highly infectious, and you know that to the point where you are shutting down the society, you've got that much knowledge of the kind of threat, and you're allowing people to get in a giant aluminum tube and come directly to Los Angeles. I've seen worse cases than that that have hung liability on somebody.
Is there any collateral damage for a lot of big tech who are, there were people that were floating this theory a year ago that were credible, and Facebook was pulling them down and Twitter was canceling them. Is there a defamation aspect to this? If there's some virologist, I
don't know. I was thinking.
So there's some virologist
I was thinking
in there
about that.
Sorry, we're having a little timing issue, but I'll power forward. Some virologist is on Tucker Carlson a year ago saying this thing was invented in a lab and escaped from the lab. The next day, the New York Times comes out with an article calling him a quack and saying this is completely unfounded and it's based on nothing, and we give it 5 Pinocchios. And this guy's losing his standing in society, in his community. Now he's sort of labeled a tinfoil hat-wearing quack. Does he have anything against the New York Times and or CNN or whoever, much like the Covington High School kids had?
That would be, to my mind, a harder case given the current state of the law. What's an interesting case to me, who were the people who were contributing to the research at the Wuhan lab? Because I know that there's been various consortiums of people and entities and governmental agencies. And if there are NGOs, non-governmental entities, if there are medical schools, or if there are others that are contributing money to sustaining that lab, I'm not so sure that you couldn't fashion liability and then get around some of the sovereign immunity issues of trying to sue the government. So, for instance, I won't mention a particular university, but there's been speculation that several U.S. universities have either detailed monies and or resources to that lab as part of World Health Organization, as part of other collaborative syndicates. If any of that is true, and you can track that down, and they didn't do something to disabuse this kind of narrative that was told post the COVID, there's some interesting legal issues there.
All right, you ready to move on to Trump and the latest trials and tribulations?
Yeah. So one of the things that to give you kind of a background on this, the Manhattan DA's office has been fighting for years to get records. They got the records. Cy Vance, then, who's the Manhattan DA, then hired a gentleman, former organized crime prosecutor, to be basically a special counsel to seek seek justice against former President Trump. The Attorney General, Letitia James, just detailed within the last week part of her office to join in that. And it was revealed today as we're speaking that a grand jury is. Two things here. If there's a grand jury, that generally means that they're taking evidence, obviously, to seek an indictment. But Trump came out with something that I thought was kind of interesting and that actually may have some legs. He brought up the fact in his statement that Letitia James, who is the Attorney General of New York, campaigned on a platform of basically going after Donald Trump. He, now that I'm sure is a Trump talking point. However, if you're representing Trump and there is a criminal indictment that is returned, one of the mistakes, if you will, that I would suggest that the Manhattan DA has got to be a little bit worried about is, why would you let them have the issue of a potential recusal, meaning that Trump, if he gets indicted, will then bring a motion to recuse Manhattan DA and the Attorney General because it's the appearance of impropriety. And that is a self-inflicted wound that they didn't need, because basically the Manhattan DA had kind of walled this thing off until it was reported that the AG had joined forces with them. You just give an argument to Trump in the defense of any potential indictment. I brought that recusal motion in various ways years ago in California and have been successful in recusing the LA County DA's office on similar kinds of appearance of impropriety types of or tainting of the prosecutor. So that's where we're at. I would predict that you will see some kind of action around somebody in the Trump organization sooner rather than later. I think it's imminent.
Do you, I know we're on a tight schedule, any updates on Giuliani?
Well, Giuliani's son is now talking about running for governor, which I find interesting, because if he were to win, the first thing he could do is pardon Trump on the state charges in New York, which nobody's talked about yet. But I thought that was an interesting thing. What they are talking about is, what if Giuliani, the son, is implicated in some way with his dad or Trump? But if it was on the state side, he would have the ability to pardon himself in the unlikely event that he won.
Wow. Never thought about that. Yes, Gary.
I also have one more thing on Rudy. There were some faulty redactions in the court documents, and that has revealed that federal investigators seized more than people previously knew. It includes an email account belonging to Ukraine's former chief prosecutor, who was deeply involved in former President Trump's pressure campaign for dirt on Joe Biden. So that's a little nugget that came out in that case.
Well, we shall keep you posted.
Yeah, we shall keep. We'll keep a prize to that, right, Adam?
Absolutely. All right, you can check out the YouTube at youtube.com/Reasonable Doubt Podcast. Free videos of podcasts and beyond of this podcast, Beyond Reasonable Doubt. So until next time, Adam Carolla for Mark Garriga saying mahalo.
Thanks for listening to Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. Stay tuned for more bonus episodes coming soon.